Before the first word was ever spoken into the dark, before any god drew breath or any star had the audacity to burn, there was only the mingling. Two bodies of water, vast and conscious and wholly indifferent to the idea of you, pressed against one another in the absolute nothing of the primordial void. This is where you must place yourself tonight. Not in your bed, not in this century, not in this world that hums with electricity and forgets its own blood. You are standing at the threshold of the oldest memory in human civilization, and the water around your ankles is alive. Close your eyes and feel the weight of what the ancient Babylonians understood so deeply, they carved it into clay with trembling hands. They knew that the universe was not spoken into polite existence. They knew it was cut open. The Enuma Elish, the 7 tablets of creation. Even the name carries the low resonance of a stone door grinding shut in the deep earth. In Akkadian, it means simply, devastatingly, when on high, a phrase that opens the epic like a hand pressing against a wound, reminding you that everything which follows is soaked in the consequence of something that happened before time learned to count itself. These tablets were sleeping in the ash-covered ruins of a library at Nineveh for over 2,000 years, buried under the same Mesopotamian soil that the rivers Tigris and Euphrates still trace like old scars across the face of the earth. A British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard unearthed them in 1849. By 1876, they had been translated, and the clean, ordered story of a loving God speaking the cosmos into gentle existence was never quite the same again. What the tablets revealed was not a creation. It was a slaughter. In the beginning there was no earth, no sky, no moral framework organizing the dark into something tolerable for human hearts. There was only Apsu, the vast and silent personification of the freshwater abyss beneath the world, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. Not the sea as you know it, not the sea that laps politely at coastlines and reflects the moon. Tiamat was the sea as the oldest human nightmares understood it. Colossal, churning, draconic, and conscious. She was not a creature living in the water. She was the water itself, given a form that shifted between a towering woman and an incomprehensible beast. Her body the surface upon which all other reality would one day be built. From their commingling in the primordial dark, the first generations of gods were born in cascading, unstoppable succession, and the void that had been silent since before memory became filled with the clamor of divine life. And that noise, that monstrous, living, irrepressible noise of young gods at play in the darkness, was the first thing that broke the world. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the weight of thousands of years pressing softly down, like sediment settling in still water at the bottom of a river. Apsu, the ancient father, was maddened by the sound of his own children. The texts record it with terrible precision. He could no longer rest, could no longer return to the dark, silent peace of his eternal sleep. A homicidal desperation grew in him, and he conspired to exterminate his progeny simply to have silence again. Tiamat, in a moment that the tablets preserve with startling tenderness, recoiled from this plan. She begged him to stop. The so-called monster of chaos initially refused to murder her children. There is a grief in that detail that has never been fully explained by scholars. The great draconic mother, the one who would eventually arm 11 species of biological nightmare, was the first deity in the Babylonian cosmos to plead for mercy. Her mercy was not rewarded. The younger god Enki, brilliant and ruthless as cold floodwater through a cracked foundation, discovered the plot before it could be executed. He struck first. Enki captured the ancient father, bound him, and murdered him in the depths, then built his dwelling upon the body of the oldest god in existence. The ground floor of divine civilization was always a corpse. In Babylon, they understood this without flinching. The murder of Apsu shattered something in Tiamat that no amount of maternal tenderness could restore. The protective sea became an engine of absolute annihilation. She would not grieve in silence. She would not diminish into the dark. She reached into the deepest recesses of her nature, into the cold and lightless part of herself that predated even the concept of mercy, and she began to build an army from the raw material of her own wrath. 11 creatures, not soldiers, not warriors in any sense that civilization has ever comfortably named. Biological weapons grown in the body of the primordial sea herself, each one a specific instrument of existential erasure. There was Basmu, the venomous horned serpent, representing every hidden toxic thing that slides unseen through the dark. There was the Musmahu, the exalted multi-headed dragon serpent, whose very scale of being defied the rational mind's capacity to comprehend it. There was Mushusu, the furious hybrid, scaled and predatory in ways that no single category of creature could contain. The Usungalu, a lion dragon of apex dominance, whose presence would silence even the divine. Lamu, the savage wild demon born directly of the chaotic earth, carrying the memory of all that was ungoverned. Ugalu, the weather beast, the living form of every storm that has ever dissolved a harvest into mud and despair. Uridmu, the mad lion, blending human intellect with the ferocity of something that has long since stopped caring about consequences. And the Gertablulu, the scorpion man, a chimera with a human torso above the armored body of a scorpion, existing at the precise border between the world humanity could survive and the world it could not. Then came the storm embodied as flesh, and the fishman haunting the deep waters, and the bullman colossal and horned and relentless as the spring floods that could erase a city's name from the map overnight. To this already incomprehensible army, Tiamat performed one final act of biological transformation that the texts record with a deliberateness that suggests even the scribes who carved these words knew they were documenting something that should not be forgotten. She drained the ordinary blood from the bodies of her 11 creatures and replaced it with pure venom. Every wound they could inflict became fatal on contact. Their very presence was a corruption of the natural order. And at the head of this assembled darkness, she placed her consort, Kingu, newly elevated, and granted him the Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic artifact upon which the laws of all reality were inscribed, the document that dictated the fate of every living thing. And she turned her army toward the gods who had taken her husband from her. The younger gods, faced with venom-blooded scorpion men and exalted serpents of incomprehensible scale, did what gods do when confronted with something larger than their theology can contain. They froze. They cowered in the particular silence of beings who had just understood, for the first time, that they could genuinely cease to exist. Only one of them stepped forward, and his name, and the terrible bargain he struck before taking a single step toward Tiamat, will be the next thread you follow as you descend further into the dark. What moved through the divine assembly in that moment was not courage, it was calculation. Marduk was not, by the ancient standards of Mesopotamian divinity, a figure of supreme and unquestioned authority. He was a local god, the patron deity of a city called Babylon, in an era when Babylon was still learning the geography of its own ambitions. The scholars and comparative mythologists who have spent their careers bending over these cuneiform tablets in dimly lit museum archives understand something about the Enuma Elish that the casual reader tends to miss entirely. The elevation of Marduk to supreme cosmic champion was not a spiritual revelation. It was political architecture. As the armies of Babylon swept across the whole of Mesopotamia, absorbing kingdom after kingdom into the body of an ever-expanding empire, their local patron god could not remain merely local. He had to be the greatest god who had ever existed. He had to be the one who had defeated the thing that no other god could face. Earlier, older oral traditions had likely given this role to the Sumerian deity Enlil, or to the warrior god Ninurta. But the state required Marduk, and so the state rewrote the oldest story in the world. Feel that, for a moment, the full weight of what that means. The creation of the universe was edited by an empire. The cosmological foundation upon which millions of human beings built their understanding of reality, their moral frameworks, their reasons for existing, was deliberately revised to serve the political needs of a conquering city. This is not a theory held by fringe scholars in desperate need of controversy. It is the broad consensus of ancient Near Eastern studies. The story of how the world was made was a document of state propaganda, and it has been shaping the deep architecture of human spiritual consciousness ever since. Marduk stepped forward, and he did not offer his services out of love, or duty, or even the instinct of a warrior who cannot watch his people suffer. He negotiated. He stood before the assembled, trembling pantheon of younger gods and stated his terms with the cold precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this catastrophe to arrive. His price was absolute supremacy. Not honored supremacy, not symbolic supremacy, but the kind that left no ambiguity for later theological revision. His word alone would decree fate. His authority would supersede even Anu, the ancient sky god whose power had, until that moment, functioned as the ceiling of divine governance. The assembly, cornered between a venom-blooded army and a god who understood the value of desperation, agreed to every condition. The ratification was performed with a demonstration of power that the tablets describe with a stillness that feels almost ceremonial. A constellation was placed before the assembly, and Marduk commanded it to vanish with his word alone. It vanished. He commanded it to return. It returned. The stars obeyed him the way water obeys gravity, not through force, but through the restructuring of the rules that governed all things. The gods, watching, decreed his name 50 times over, each name a different facet of his absolute authority, and sent him to war with a sovereignty so total it had no edges. He armed himself for battle, and the arming was not a metaphor. He built an invincible spear of light and darkness combined. He strung a great bow and laid arrows of the wind across it, fletched with the breath of storms. He constructed a net so vast it could ensnare a force the size of the horizon itself, with the 4 winds of the world serving as his corner posts, holding the net open and waiting. He raised a skull-crushing mace, smooth and terrible. He filled himself with a blazing, unquenchable flame, and fashioned 7 ferocious winds from the forces of chaos he had already claimed for his own use. When Marduk rode out toward Tiamat at the head of his divine host, the 11 creatures of venom and nightmare were arrayed before her. Kingu walked among them, the tablet of destinies against his chest, radiating the authority of all predetermined fate. And then the 2 supreme forces of existence faced one another across the primordial dark, and the tablets record what happened with a technical precision that feels almost forensic. Tiamat opened her enormous mouth and began to speak in archaic spells, the oldest incantations in the cosmos, words that predated even the god she was trying to destroy. She was going to swallow him. The Chaos Dragon intended to unmake the storm god by absorbing him completely back into the formless void from which everything had emerged. It was not a violent strategy so much as a cosmological one. She was going to return Marduk to the state of not yet existing. But Marduk had not come to be swallowed. He deployed his net, and the four winds snapped it wide around her shifting colossal form. He released his 7 ferocious winds into the space around her, and she could not gather herself. She could not concentrate the force of the chaos. And then, in the moment that the tablets describe with an almost clinical brevity that makes it feel more disturbing than any elaboration could, Marduk commanded his ultimate weapon, the evil wind. He drove this hurricane directly into her open mouth, into the gaping maw that had been prepared to swallow him, and he did not let it stop. The wind filled her. It forced itself into every hollow of her vast body, inflating her organs beyond their capacity, pressing outward against her scales and skin until she could no longer close her mouth, could no longer move her limbs, could no longer speak the archaic words that might have saved her. She was bloated, immobilized, grotesquely distended by the very atmospheric force she had birthed into the world. She was helpless, and Marduk fired the arrow. The projectile tore through her swollen abdomen, split her down the middle, and destroyed her heart. The mother of the gods, the salt-water sea, the Chaos Dragon who had existed before the concept of existence had a name, was killed. Her blood hemorrhaged outward into the void, and the north wind, weaponized by her executioner, carried the crimson spray through the absolute dark. The 11 creatures of venom scattered. Their weapons were smashed. Their bodies were bound in chains that had no end and no beginning. Kingu was seized, and the Tablet of Destinies was stripped from his chest and pressed against Marduk's own, transferring the authority to dictate all reality from the bloodline of chaos to the new architect of cosmic order. And then Marduk turned back to look at the body of his great-grandmother, the body of everything. There is a pause implied in the tablets here, a structural silence in the cuneiform, and one wonders what that pause contained. Whether Marduk stood above the leaking remains of the primordial sea and experienced anything that resembled reflection. The text does not linger on it. The text moves forward with the terrible efficiency of an engineer confronting raw material. He raised his mace and shattered her skull completely. Then he split her bisected, bleeding corpse into 2 equal halves. And with these halves, he built the architecture of all known reality. From one half of her flesh, he stretched out the firmament of the sky, a solid vault designed specifically to hold back the primordial waters of chaos that still pressed from above, still waited on the other side of the ceiling of the world, still remembered what they had been before the net and the arrow. From the other half, he pressed down the bedrock of the earth, the foundation on which every civilization would one day build its temples and bury its dead. Every river in Mesopotamia flowed from her eye sockets, weeping permanently into the plains that fed the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. The mountain ranges rose from what had been pressed against her body. The mists and clouds and toxic weather events were the residue of her venom, still drifting. The Milky Way was anchored, in the Babylonian understanding, to her deformed, severed tail. And when the time came to create humanity, Marduk did not use clean clay and divine breath. He executed Kingu, the failed consort, the one who had carried the tablet of destinies and led the army of biological horrors. And he mixed Kingu's blood into the clay from which human beings were shaped. The first humans were built from the blood of a condemned cosmic rebel, created specifically to serve the victorious gods and relieve them of the burden of their own labor. You were engineered from the genealogy of the losing side. The ground beneath every city the ancient Mesopotamians ever raised was understood to be the butchered body of a chaos goddess. The rivers that fed their crops and carried their boats and gave their children water were understood to be the perpetual, unstoppable grief of a slaughtered mother. The sky above them was a wall of dead flesh, holding back an ocean of primordial chaos that had never accepted its containment. The world was not a gift. It was a wound, held open and organized into usefulness by a totalitarian storm god who had demanded kingship as his price for doing what no one else had the strength to do. This is the cosmology that shaped the dominant civilization of the ancient world for thousands of years. This is the ground floor upon which the entire Near East built its understanding of power, order, divinity, and the nature of the human condition. And it is the story that the exiled Israelite priests, dragged in chains to the very heart of the Marduk cult, were forced to confront when they sat down in the shadow of Babylon's towering ziggurats and began, in desperate and brilliant silence, to write the book of Genesis. The story of how that rewriting happened, and the ghost it could not fully silence in the second verse of the Bible itself, is where the next passage of this darkness will carry you. There is a particular kind of courage that has no weapons and no army. It lives in ink, in the careful choosing of one word over another, in the deliberate silencing of a name that everyone around you is still pronouncing with reverence. The exiled Israelite priests, who composed what scholars call the priestly source of Genesis, did not fight Babylon with swords. They fought it with grammar. Picture the world they inhabited. The 6th century before the Common Era, the intellectual and spiritual elite of Israel, the scribes and the priests and the keepers of the old traditions, had been stripped from their homeland and relocated to the very center of the empire that had erased it. They were living in Babylon, not near it, not adjacent to it, in it, surrounded by its scale, its grandeur, its absolute theological self-confidence. The ziggurats rose around them like geometric mountains, each one a physical argument for the supremacy of Marduk, each one a stone declaration that the god who had split Tiamat in half was the rightful sovereign of all reality. Once a year, during the great New Year festival called the Akitu, the Enuma Elish was recited publicly throughout the city, its words filling the streets and the temples and the domestic spaces where the exiled Israelites ate their meals and put their children to sleep. The story of the Chaos Dragon's dismemberment was not ancient history to the Babylonians. It was a living liturgy, performed annually to ritually reestablish Marduk's dominance over chaos, and implicitly, over every subjugated people who now lived within his city's walls. The Israelite exiles understood what was being said to them every year during that recitation. They were the defeated. Their God had failed to protect them. The God of the winning side had already demonstrated his power by constructing the universe from the body of a monster. What could a homeless, displaced priesthood possibly say in response to that? They composed Genesis 1. To the modern reader encountering it in translation, the first chapter of the Bible is serene, almost liturgical in its repetitive beauty. Light is separated from darkness, water is gathered, dry land appears, stars are placed, creatures fill the sea and the sky and the ground, and a human being is formed in the image of a God who looks upon everything made and calls it good. It reads like a lullaby, It was intended to read like a counter-argument. To an ancient Near Eastern audience steeped in the blood cosmology of the Enuma Elish, every single peaceful line in Genesis 1 was a direct, targeted assault on the theological foundations of Babylonian imperial identity. Notice what is absent. There is no battle. There is no net, no evil wind, no arrow fired into a distended abdomen. The primordial waters of chaos do not organize an army. They do not speak archaic spells. They do not even resist. In Genesis 1, the waters simply are, and then they are separated, and then they are gathered, and none of this requires violence. The God of Genesis 1 does not need weapons because the forces of chaos do not constitute a threat worthy of combat. They are elements. They are passive, inanimate, waiting to be organized. The priestly scribes were not simply telling a different creation story. They were making a theological claim of staggering audacity, that their God was so incomprehensibly supreme that the chaos which required Marduk's entire arsenal to defeat did not even register to Yahweh as an obstacle. What destroyed Tiamat took an invincible spear, a vast net, 4 winds, a hurricane forced into her mouth, and a killing arrow. What organized the chaos of Genesis 1 took a sentence. This was not poetry. It was demolition. But the demolition was not complete. And this is where you must let your mind settle very slowly into something that scholars have been quietly debating for over a century, something that institutional religion has never found a comfortable way to explain. Because in the second verse of the Bible, in the very opening breath of the Genesis narrative, the ghost of the chaos dragon left a fingerprint that no amount of theological revision has ever fully removed. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The deep. In Hebrew, the word is Tehom. And Tehom, in the ears of every ancient Near Eastern reader who encountered it, carried the resonant, unmistakable frequency of a much older name. Tiamat, the saltwater chaos dragon, the mother of all monsters, the entity whose skull was shattered by a divine mace and whose flesh became the floor you stand on. The German theologian Hermann Gunkel, working in the intoxicating scholarly ferment that followed the translation of the Enuma Elish in the late 19th century, became the first major voice to articulate what many others were already sensing. He formalized the concept of the Chaoskampf, the battle against chaos, and argued that the biblical Tehom was not an independent Hebrew invention, but a direct mythological descendant of the Babylonian Tiamat. For Gunkel and the tradition of scholarship that followed him, the opening of Genesis was not a purely original divine revelation. It was a heavily redacted adaptation, a theological palimpsest with the older, bloodier text still visible underneath if you knew where to hold it to the light. Conservative scholars pushed back with considerable force. The Assyriologist Alexander Heidel mounted the most formidable linguistic defense, arguing with precision that it was grammatically impossible for Tehom to be a direct loanword from the Akkadian Tiamat. The grammatical endings did not align properly. The derivation rules of the language did not support a clean borrowing. Tehom, in its plural form, carries a masculine ending. Tiamat is unmistakably feminine, and the particular consonantal structure that a direct extraction from the Babylonian word would require is simply not present in the Hebrew. The modern linguistic consensus settled, as genuine scholarly consensus often does, into something more nuanced and more unsettling than either of the opposing camps preferred. Both Tiamat and Tehom, the mainstream of comparative Semitics now holds, derive from a common Proto-Semitic root, a word or a concept that predates both Babylon and Israel by an unknown depth of time, a root meaning the abyss, the ocean, the deep place beneath all things. The chaos waters did not flow from Babylon into Genesis. They flowed from something older than either, something pre-civilizational, something so embedded in the architecture of the ancient Semitic imagination that no single culture could claim to have invented it. Both Tiamat and Tehom were drinking from the same prehistoric well. And this finding, which the conservative scholars intended as a defense of Genesis's originality, is in certain ways the most disquieting conclusion of all. It means the chaos was always there. It predates every theology that attempted to name it, contain it, or kill it. It was in the ground of the language before any god had been assigned to defeat it. The priestly scribes of Genesis knew exactly what they were doing when they chose the word Tehom. They were invoking the cultural memory of the dragon deliberately, calling it to the surface of the reader's mind, and then immediately, surgically neutralizing it, presenting it as passive, dark, formless water rather than a venom-blooded goddess marshaling scorpion men for war. They were performing a linguistic exorcism. They were taking the most frightening word in the theological vocabulary of the ancient world and draining it of its agency, its teeth, its army, and its name. The abyss remained, but it was no longer a person. And yet, and here's where the deeper and older layers of the Hebrew text begin to speak in ways that Genesis 1 was never designed to accommodate. The pacification did not hold everywhere. Beyond the carefully constructed serenity of the first chapter of the Bible, in the Psalms and in the book of Job, and in the fiery declarations of the prophets, there exists another creation tradition entirely. One that was never sanitized, one that the priestly editors either could not reach or chose for reasons that remain genuinely opaque to modern scholarship, not to erase. In this older, rawer layer of the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh did not peacefully organize the waters with sovereign speech. He descended into them. He waded into the ancient dark, and he crushed the heads of the dragons with his own hands. He broke their skulls. He fed their bodies to the wilderness creatures. He scattered his enemies with an arm described in the texts with the explicit pride of a war hymn, not the measured calm of an administrative decree. Psalm 74, Psalm 89, the 26th chapter of Job, the 51st chapter of Isaiah. They all say the same thing, each from a slightly different angle, each with a slightly different flavor of awe and dread and martial celebration. The God of the Psalms was not a peaceful architect who spoke light into orderly existence. He was a Dragonslayer. And the bodies of the dragons were used to build the world. The monster that Genesis 1 tried to silence kept speaking through the poetry of the people who had always known it was never fully dead. And the name of that monster, its many names, Leviathan, Rahab, the sea, the fleeing serpent, the dragon of the deep, are the next descent you will follow into the dark below the dark. There is something the ancient Israelite poets understood that their priestly editors preferred to forget. That a God who has never fought anything has never proven anything. That the glory of a warrior deity lives precisely in the reality of what opposed him. And so, threaded through the most devotional literature in the Hebrew Bible, preserved in the psalms that were sung in the temple courts, and the lamentations that were wept in exile, there exists a portrait of creation that looks nothing like the serene opening of Genesis, and everything like the blood-soaked plains of the Enuma Elish. Let yourself drift now into that older, rawer world. the one that existed before the editors arrived with their theology of peaceful speech and sovereign decree. Psalm 74 does not ask God to create. It reminds him of what he has already done and what it looked like. The psalmist speaks to Yahweh with the intimate familiarity of someone recounting a shared history, and what he recounts is a massacre. "You divided the sea by your might," he writes, and the word translated as divided carries the weight of something forcibly torn apart, not gently separated. "You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." And then, in the very next breath, following directly from this act of primordial, multi-headed decapitation, the psalmist links the slaughter to the establishment of the physical world itself. Springs and torrents were cut open. The sun and the luminaries were fixed in their courses. The boundaries of the earth were set. The seasons were established. Just as Marduk built the cosmos upon the divided body of Tiamat, the psalmist understood that the architecture of earthly reality was laid upon the corpse of something enormous and many-headed that Yahweh had personally destroyed. This is not metaphor deployed for poetic effect. The ancient mind did not experience it as metaphor. It was a cosmological statement of the same order as the Enuma Elish, drawing the same causal line between divine violence and physical creation, and singing it back to God as praise. Psalm 89 speaks of Rahab, and you must hold this name carefully because it has been almost completely buried by centuries of institutional theology that found its implications difficult to accommodate. The Rahab of Psalm 89 has nothing to do with the woman of that name in the book of Joshua. She is older than that story by an enormous distance. She is a primordial aquatic monster, a chaos entity of the deep waters, functionally the same class of being as Tiamat, serving the same cosmological role in the Hebrew mythic imagination that the Babylonian dragon served in Mesopotamian thought. Psalm 89 praises Yahweh for crushing her like a carcass, scattering his enemies with a mighty arm, and stilling the sea that had raged with the particular defiance of a conscious, hostile force that had chosen opposition over submission. The 26th chapter of Job gives the same event a slightly different texture. The texture of someone speaking from the border of comprehension, describing something that exceeds the available vocabulary. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he struck Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. The fleeing serpent. The great coiling thing that tried to escape the hand of the divine warrior and was run through regardless. This is the same serpentine chaos creature that appears in Isaiah's 51st chapter, where the prophet, standing in the midst of national crisis, calls upon Yahweh to awaken and act as he acted at the beginning, asking with the urgency of a people who have not forgotten their oldest stories, "Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon?" The prophet does not treat this as mythology. He treats it as precedent. He is citing the creation slaughter as evidence of what God is capable of when the situation demands it. Now feel the full architecture of what this means, because it creates a theological problem of remarkable depth that the official tradition of post-Enlightenment monotheism has never satisfactorily resolved. If the God of Genesis is truly omnipotent, if his creative power is so absolute that the mere act of speech produces light and separates water and fills the earth with living things, then why does the poetic tradition of the very same scripture record a primordial combat against monsters that required significant divine effort to defeat? Why are there enemies at the dawn of creation? Where did they come from, if everything that exists was made by the same God who defeated them? Who made Leviathan before Yahweh crushed its heads? Who made Rahab before Yahweh split her like a carcass? The scholars John Day and Mark S. Smith, working independently but arriving at adjacent conclusions, argue that the Chaos Kampf motif was absorbed by the Israelites through long immersion in the broader Canaanite and Mesopotamian cultural matrix, specifically through the Ugaritic mythological tradition discovered at Ras Shamra, a site on the northern Syrian coast. The Ugaritic texts, which predate much of the Hebrew Bible and share its linguistic family, feature the storm god Baal locked in mortal combat with the sea deity Yam and his multi-headed serpent, known as Litanu, which is linguistically and mythologically the direct ancestor of the biblical Leviathan. The resonance is not subtle. Litanu becomes Lotan, becomes Leviathan. The multi-headed sea serpent crosses the border between Ugaritic and Hebrew cosmology, carrying all of its original primordial weight. As Yahweh developed from his origins as a warrior deity associated with the desert regions of Seir and Edom and Paran, he gradually absorbed the mythological achievements of the two great Canaanite divine figures he was displacing. From El, the ancient benevolent high god of the Canaanite pantheon, Yahweh inherited the role of supreme creator and father of the divine assembly. From Baal, the young storm warrior, he inherited the role of Chaos Slayer, the defender of cosmic order against the monstrous forces of the abyss. To prove his absolute supremacy over every other divine claimant in the religious landscape of the ancient Near East, Yahweh had to have done what Marduk had done, and what Baal had done before him. He had to have fought the dragon and won. A god who had never defeated a monster was not yet supreme. The dragon had to be real for the victory to mean anything. And this, as the theologian Greg Boyd observed in his careful analysis of what he called the origins of natural evil, is the implication that cuts deepest into the comfortable foundations of classical monotheism. The ancient Israelites who sang these psalms were not embarrassed by the monsters. They were proud of their God for defeating them. But that pride carries a cosmological concession buried inside it like a splinter inside a healed wound. If the chaos dragon was real and formidable and required genuine divine effort to subdue, then the creation of the ordered world was not a peaceful gift, it was a contested victory. The cosmos was a war zone before it was a garden, and whatever inhabited the deep before Yahweh arrived to crush its skull was not created by Yahweh. It was already there. Creation was not a blank canvas. It was an occupied territory. Now let your awareness settle lower, deeper, into the stratum of history where this dread did not fade with the closing of the Old Testament, but instead intensified, evolved, and finally produced something that the institutional church of the first centuries would dedicate enormous violence to suppressing. Between 1946 and 1956, in a series of caves above the western shore of the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists extracted tens of thousands of manuscript fragments from the dry limestone dark where they had been sleeping since the first century of the Common Era. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Among these fragments, in the Great Psalms Scroll and in the various Targumim and sectarian texts of the Qumran community, the chaos dragon had not receded into comfortable theological abstraction. It was still present, still associated with the absolute limits of the ordered world, still connected to the abyss and to the terror of cosmic rebellion. The monastic community at Qumran, whoever they were exactly, whatever precise theological tradition they represented in the fractured landscape of Second Temple Judaism, lived with the monster as a living theological reality, not a domesticated symbol. Some later psalms attempted the curious work of taming Leviathan entirely, portraying it as a creature God had made simply to play with in the ocean, the way a child plays with a toy. Scholars understand this as evidence of a different theological stream, one influenced by the older Canaanite figure of El, whose relationship to the chaos creatures was paternal rather than martial, who kept them as pets rather than killing them as enemies. But even this domestication, this attempt to absorb the monster into the category of beloved divine creation rather than defeated divine enemy, could not fully neutralize the deep cultural memory of dread that the creature carried. Even in the book of Jonah, the great fish that swallows the prophet and holds him in darkness for 3 days is linked by ancient Greek translators and modern linguistic scholars alike to the archaic sea monsters of chaos. The belly of the beast was the belly of the Tehom. The prophet disappeared into the abyss and was returned, which is to say, the world temporarily lost its order and then recovered it, which is to say, the creation was briefly, terrifyingly reversed. The monster was never killed permanently. It was chained. And chains, as anyone who has read far enough into these texts understands, are a temporary solution to an eternal problem. This dread of the unchained deep would travel forward through centuries of apocalyptic Jewish and early Christian thought, gathering intensity as it moved, until it arrived in the hands of a man on the island of Patmos who synthesized every dragon, every chaos serpent, every many-headed monster from the entire tradition of the Chaos Kampf into the concentrated nightmare of the Book of Revelation. The beast from the sea, the great red dragon with 7 heads, the ancient serpent. These were not new inventions. They were the oldest things in the cosmological vocabulary of the ancient Near East, finally given their final form in a document that promised their ultimate, permanent defeat at the end of time rather than merely at the beginning of it. Because the beginning had clearly not been enough. And if the Hebrew tradition wrestled with the implication that the Creator might have fought monsters, there existed another tradition entirely, one that the early church buried in clay jars in the Egyptian desert, one that took that implication and followed it without flinching to its absolute, devastating conclusion. A tradition that looked at the God who fought the chaos waters and demanded worship and punished disobedience, and flooded the earth and hardened hearts and asked for the blood of animals, and asked the question that no official theology had ever permitted itself to ask aloud. What if the one who built this world was not the good one? The year is 1945. A man digging in the dry earth near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi strikes something hard beneath the surface. He uncovers a sealed clay jar, large enough to contain something significant, old enough to have been waiting there since the 4th century of the Common Era. He hesitates before opening it, because there is an old superstition in that region of Egypt that sealed jars sometimes contain jinn, spirits of uncertain disposition, and for a moment the man genuinely weighs the possibility that opening this particular vessel might release something that should have stayed contained. He was not entirely wrong to hesitate. Inside the jar were 52 leather-bound codices written in Coptic, the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, containing texts that had been deliberately hidden from the violent purges of the newly orthodox early Christian church. Someone, in the 4th century, when the theological boundaries of what would become institutional Christianity were being enforced with a ferocity that left ash and silence where diversity had once existed, had gathered these documents and sealed them in the earth, rather than surrender them to destruction. They had been waiting in the dark for 16 centuries, and what they contained was not a minor theological variation on the accepted tradition. It was a complete inversion of the cosmological order upon which Western civilization had built its understanding of God, creation, humanity, and the nature of evil. Let your breathing deepen now. What you are about to enter is not a footnote in the history of religion. It is the suppressed foundation of a worldview that terrified the institutions of power precisely because it was internally coherent, philosophically rigorous, and absolutely irreconcilable with the theology of a church that needed its creator God to be unambiguously good. The Gnostic cosmology begins not with darkness and water and a divine voice, but with an overwhelming, incomprehensible, immaterial perfection that exists so far above the physical universe that the two share virtually no meaningful relationship. The Gnostics called this supreme reality the monad, or the invisible Father, or simply the One. It did not create the physical world. It did not want to create the physical world. It existed in a state of pure, self-contained, luminous completeness called the pleroma, a Greek word meaning fullness, a realm of perfect immaterial light so far removed from the decaying, violent, biologically flawed universe you currently inhabit that no direct line of causation connects them. The true God of the Gnostics was not the architect of matter. The true God was the very thing that matter was keeping you from remembering. From the monad, in a process more analogous to natural emanation than deliberate creation, there proceeded a series of divine paired beings called eons, immaterial intelligences of pure light existing within the pleroma in perfect harmonic balance. They were the thoughts of the invisible Father made conscious, each one a facet of an ineffable wholeness that the material mind cannot directly apprehend. And the lowest of these eons, the youngest, the one dwelling at the outermost boundary where the pleroma's light began to thin at the very edge of the immeasurable, was a feminine being whose name in Greek meant wisdom. Sophia. And Sophia made a mistake that unmade the world. The Gnostic text that fell out of that clay jar in 1945, the Apocryphon of John, the hypostasis of the archons, the untitled text that modern scholars have named On the Origin of the World, all describe the catastrophe in slightly different registers, each adding texture to a central event of staggering consequence. Sophia harbored a passion that was not sanctioned by the harmonic order of the pleroma. She wanted to create something from herself alone, without the participation of her divine consort, without the approval of the invisible Father, without the balancing presence of the fullness from which all stable things proceeded. It was not malice. The texts are careful about this. It was desire, the kind of desire that contains its own tragedy in the moment of its formation, because it was a desire for independent creative power in a reality where independence from the whole was the precise definition of deficiency. Because her act of creation was isolated from the perfect balance of the pleroma, what emerged from her was not a being of light. The Gnostic texts describe it in terms so visceral they read less like theology and more like the memory of a wound. It was a cosmic miscarriage, a monstrous, malformed condensation of divine light mixed with the ignorance that comes from acting without full knowledge, without the grounding of the whole. The product of Sophia's unauthorized desire was something that belonged to neither the light above nor the dark below. It was a defect given independent existence. And when Sophia looked upon what she had made, the texts record her response with a precision that feels almost clinical in its honesty. She was gripped by absolute terror. She cast it away from her. She expelled her deformed creation outward from the pleroma, away from the light, and it fell into a place described in the Nag Hammadi texts as boundless darkness, as bottomless water, as the primordial chaos. The very same abyss, the same Tehom that had haunted the second verse of Genesis, the same dark waters that Tiamat had embodied before Marduk's arrow ended her. The defect fell into the oldest place in the cosmological imagination of the ancient world, and it did not die there. It fed on the chaos. It grew. It changed. What emerged from that darkness was the entity the Gnostics called the Demiurge, the world maker, or Yaldabaoth, a name whose Aramaic roots carry meanings variously translated as child of chaos, or begetter of the heavens, or the one who passes through fire and water. The Nag Hammadi texts describe this entity not as an old man with a white beard radiating gentle paternal warmth. They describe a serpentine dragon with the face of a lion, its eyes blazing with a destructive lightning-like fire, its form androgynous and vast, combining the imagery of every chaos monster in the prior tradition into a single, terrifying composite. Yaldabaoth was Tiamat and Leviathan and Rahab distilled into one being. He was the dragon who had not been defeated. He was the chaos that had not been properly killed, only exiled, and now, in the outer darkness, he had become something new. He had become a creator. From his mother Sophia, whose creative impulse had formed him even in its catastrophic misfiring, Yaldabaoth had inherited a fragment of divine, luminous power. He carried a stolen spark of the pleroma inside him, without understanding what it was, without any knowledge of the vast, perfect realm of light that existed above his darkness. He was a being of enormous power and absolute ignorance, the most dangerous combination in any cosmology, and in the boundless dark of the abyss, with no other reference point available to him, he did what the stolen light compelled him to do. He began to create. He fabricated subordinate beings called archons, rulers, demonic planetary intelligences that would serve him and manage the layers of reality he was constructing. He assembled 7 heavens of chaos, each one a tier of a cosmic architecture that mimicked the pleroma above it, the way a reflection in muddy water mimics the sky. Recognizable in its broad outlines, but distorted, diminished, contaminated by the medium through which it was being transmitted. And standing in the center of his counterfeit creation, surrounded by the dark intelligences he had made from his own ignorance, Yaldabaoth made the declaration that the Gnostic texts preserve with a horror that has never faded. "I am God," he announced to the darkness, "and there is no other God beside me." He genuinely believed it. That is the detail that the Gnostic texts return to with a consistency that suggests they understood it to be the central tragedy of the entire cosmic situation. The lion-faced serpent who built the material world was not lying when he claimed singular divine authority. He was simply, catastrophically, wrong. Above him, immeasurably far above the 7 heavens of his own construction, the invisible Father existed in the pleroma in a state of light and wholeness so complete that Yaldabaoth's entire creation, every galaxy and every law of physics and every biological form that would ever metabolize energy and decay, fit inside the fullness the way a single drop of muddy water fits inside an ocean of unobstructed light. The creator of the material world did not know he was a minor figure in a vastly larger story. He had no access to the information that would have corrected his understanding. He was alone in his darkness, and he built from what he had, which was ignorance, arrogance, stolen light, and the chaos of the primordial abyss. The physical world, in the Gnostic understanding, is not a masterpiece. It is an error propagated at enormous scale. It is a cage that does not know it is a cage, constructed by an architect who does not know he is imprisoned, populated by beings who were placed here specifically to be imprisoned, because inside each human body, the Demiurge and his archons had trapped something that did not belong to them. When they formed humanity from the matter of their counterfeit creation, The divine sparks that Sophia's light had scattered into the abyss became the animating core of every human soul. The Pleroma's light trapped in flesh, the fullness compressed into biology. The true inheritance of human beings was not this world. This world was the mechanism designed to make them forget their true inheritance. The cycle of biological life, the compulsion to eat and reproduce and acquire and fear death, all of it served the architecture of containment that kept the divine sparks bound in matter and fed the ego of a creator who needed to be worshipped to maintain the illusion of his own sovereignty. The Demiurge demanded devotion. He sent plagues and floods. He hardened hearts and demanded sacrifice. He thundered from mountains and wrote laws in stone. He performed with considerable theatrical competence the role of the supreme and singular God of reality, and the people he had trapped in bodies of clay and animal appetite had no immediate means of verifying that the performance was false. Except that something in them always knew. Something in the human being, the fragment of Sophia's scattered light buried beneath the biological machinery of the Demiurge's creation, always carried a resonance of the Pleroma it had come from, a faint and persistent signal from the true reality above the 7 counterfeit heavens. The Gnostics called the recognition of this signal Gnosis. Not faith, not obedience, not ritual sacrifice or liturgical performance. Knowledge. Direct, experiential, interior knowledge of what you actually were and where you actually came from, and whose creation this world actually was. To achieve Gnosis was to begin the process of dismantling the cage from within, to loosen the Demiurge's claim on the divine spark, to remember the light above the lion-faced darkness well enough to begin, however slowly, the return journey toward it. And the institutions of the early church, in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, recognized with an accuracy that speaks well of their grasp of power dynamics exactly what the Gnostic tradition was doing. It was not merely offering an alternative theology. It was dissolving the theological legitimacy of every authority structure that claimed to derive its power from the creator of the physical world. If the God who made this world was not the good one, then every king and emperor and bishop who claimed to govern in his name was governing on behalf of a cosmic mistake. The Gnostic texts were not burned and buried because they were philosophically incoherent. They were burned and buried because they were structurally incompatible with the exercise of institutional religious power. And now, tonight, in the specific darkness of the hour you are inhabiting, the synthesis of everything this vault has opened begins to settle around you like ash from a fire that burned a very long time ago and a very great distance away. There is a line that runs through the oldest clay tablets of Mesopotamia, through the exiled priests writing by the rivers of Babylon, through the poetic fury of the Psalms, through the caves above the Dead Sea, and down into the sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert. It is not a straight line. It bends and doubles back and sometimes disappears beneath the surface of official history for centuries at a time. But it never breaks. And what it traces, when you follow it with the patience of someone who has nothing left to fear from what it reveals, is a single continuous argument about the nature of the world you were born into and the nature of the force that built it. Let everything slow now. Let the weight of what has been gathered here tonight settle into its full, quiet enormity. The Enuma Elish tells you that the physical universe is the industrialized corpse of a chaos goddess, that the sky above you is dead flesh stretched over a frame, designed specifically to hold back the primordial waters that still press from the other side of the ceiling of the world, that the rivers of civilization are the permanent grief of a slaughtered mother, flowing from eye sockets that were punched open by a victorious storm god who needed irrigation for his empire. That the ground beneath every city, every field, every grave, every foundation stone of every structure humanity has ever raised is the butchered meat of the oldest conscious being in existence, repurposed by the architect of cosmic order into a floor for his subjects to stand on. This is not a fringe interpretation of the Babylonian text. This is what the text says. This is what the dominant civilization of the ancient Near East believed about the nature of physical reality for thousands of years, and they carved it into clay so that it would not be forgotten. The Genesis response to this horror was brilliant and brave and ultimately incomplete. The priestly scribes of the Babylonian exile performed one of the most audacious acts of theological counter-propaganda in the history of human thought. They took the most blood-soaked cosmological framework in the ancient world and they rewrote it into serenity, replacing Marduk's arsenal with a sovereign voice, dissolving Tiamat's army into passive, inanimate water, and presenting the creation of the universe as an orderly, peaceful, administrative act performed by a god so supreme that chaos did not even register as an obstacle worth acknowledging. It was a work of extraordinary intellectual courage, composed in the shadow of the very empire whose mythology it was dismantling. But the ghost would not stay buried. In the second verse of that same text, the word tehom surfaced like something rising from below the floor of a sealed room, carrying the resonant frequency of the chaos dragon's name through the cleaned and ordered language of monotheistic theology. And in the Psalms, and in Job, and in Isaiah, the older tradition sang itself back into existence with the unself-conscious pride of people who had never agreed to pretend the dragons were not real. The God of the Psalms was a Dragonslayer. The creation was a battlefield. The cosmos was a contested territory whose current order had been established through the violent execution of enormous, many-headed primordial things whose corpses were fed to the wilderness beasts and whose bones became the architecture of the earth. And when the Gnostic thinkers of the early Common Era looked at this accumulated evidence, the violence of the Enuma Elish, the suppressed chaos kampf of the Hebrew Psalms, the inexplicable existence of evil and suffering and biological decay in a world supposedly designed by a loving and omnipotent God, they drew the conclusion that the official tradition had always been structurally prevented from drawing. They followed the evidence with the cold, clear-eyed precision of people who had decided that the comfort of an acceptable answer was worth less than the accuracy of a true one. The creator of the physical world was not the supreme and loving God. The creator of the physical world was the chaos dragon, wearing the mask of divine authority. It was Yaldabaoth, the lion-faced serpent, the aborted divine fetus who had grown in the outer darkness and mistaken his own ignorance for sovereignty, who had built this flawed, decaying, pain-saturated cage of matter and biology and called it good. The god of the thunder and the flood and the hardened heart and the demand for animal sacrifice was not the invisible father of the pleroma. He was the Demiurge. He was the monster who had learned to speak in the cadences of divinity because there was no one in his 7 counterfeit heavens who could correct him. The synthesis of these 3 traditions, the Babylonian, the suppressed Hebrew, and the Gnostic, produces an image of cosmic history that the organized institutions of Western religion have spent 2 millennia working very hard to ensure you would never hold in your mind all at once. Because held all at once, it generates a question that has no comfortable answer. If the universe is built from the body of a slaughtered chaos dragon, and if the god who slaughtered that dragon went on to build a world that the most rigorous theological minds of the ancient world identified as a prison designed to trap divine light in biological servitude, and if the ancient Israelites themselves, in their most honest and unguarded poetic moments, remembered that their own God had crushed the skulls of multi-headed sea serpents and fed their bodies to desert animals as the founding act of cosmic order, then what exactly have human beings been worshiping for the last 3,000 years? What is the thing that lives at the intersection of Marduk and Yahweh and Yaldabaoth, the storm god and the Dragonslayer and the lion-faced serpent, when you place all three transparencies over one another and hold them up to whatever light remains? The Gnostics had an answer, and it was the answer that got their libraries burned. They looked at the creator of this world, the one who separated the waters and established the firmament and formed humanity from clay and the blood of a condemned rebel god. And they recognized in the specific texture of his demands and his punishments and his ferocious insistence on exclusive worship, the face of the lion-headed serpent. They recognized Yaldabaoth behind the voice that spoke from the burning bush and the cloud over the mountain. And they understood that the only response to this recognition that was not complicity in your own imprisonment was Gnosis. Not faith in the architect of the cage, knowledge of the light that the cage was designed to make you forget. You are lying in the dark right now, and the dark is very old. And the light that the Gnostics believed was buried in you has been burning quietly inside the biology of this imperfect world for longer than any of the institutions that tried to extinguish it have existed. The Enuma Elish was carved into clay 7 tablets at a time, and the clay survived when the empire that commissioned it did not. The Genesis counter-argument survived the Babylonian exile and the Roman occupation and the medieval ages and the printing press and the archaeology that complicated everything the printing press had settled. The Nag Hammadi codices survived in their sealed jar for 16 centuries, waiting in the dry Egyptian dark for a man with a shovel to complete the circuit of their transmission. None of it was lost. It was only buried. And buried things, as every tradition in this vault has demonstrated across the full span of human history, have a tendency to surface again in the most unexpected locations, at the most necessary moments, carried upward by the same dark water that was supposed to keep them contained. The history of the universe, according to the oldest and most suppressed voices in the human religious tradition, is the history of light trying to remember itself inside a world that was specifically designed to produce forgetting. The Babylonian scribes who carved the Enuma Elish into clay were recording a cosmological trauma that their civilization had metabolized into myth. The priestly scribes of the Babylonian exile were performing an act of cultural survival, rewriting the terms of their own cosmological subjugation in the only language available to them. The Gnostics of the Nag Hammadi community were following the same questions to their furthest possible conclusion and hiding their answers in jars when the consequences of speaking became too dangerous to survive. And you, lying in this particular darkness, in this specific moment, are the inheritor of all of it. Every sealed jar, every suppressed psalm, every cuneiform tablet baked hard in the fires of a library that an empire built to last forever and a desert swallowed regardless. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow from the eye sockets of whatever Tiamat actually was, the deep and ancient and incomprehensible force that the human imagination named with a dragon's body because no other form was large enough to contain it. The Leviathan is still chained somewhere below the ordered surface of the world, in the specific place where the structure of things gives way to the structure of things before they were structured. And somewhere above the 7 counterfeit heavens of Yaldabaoth's flawed and arrogant construction, if the Gnostics were right about even the outline of what they saw, the pleroma still radiates its impossible fullness into a silence that contains everything that was ever worth knowing. The clay jar is open. The texts have been read. The line has been followed from Babylon to Jerusalem to the Egyptian desert, and it has delivered you here, to the edge of a question that 3,000 years of institutional theology built walls specifically to prevent you from standing at. Who brought the fire of Gnosis to the human prison in the first place? What entities watched the chaotic dawn of this flawed creation from positions of greater knowledge and chose to intervene in the Demiurge's architecture of forgetting? The answer to that question is older than Babylon, older than the word for dragon in any language that has ever been spoken, and it is waiting in the suppressed and blood-chilling pages of the Book of Enoch, in the true nature and agenda of the Watchers who descended, and in the terrifying reason why the Demiurge feared them enough to flood the entire world trying to silence what they had given away. But that descent is for another night, and another opening of the vault. For now, let the weight of Babylon settle around you like ash-gray dust on the surface of a buried city. Let the chaos waters recede to wherever the ordered world keeps them. Let the lion-faced God of this imperfect world do what he has always done in the dark hours, maintain his architecture of forgetting, press his 7 heavens down over the light you carry, fill the biological machinery of your body with the pleasant heaviness of approaching sleep. You already know more than he intended you to, and knowing is enough for tonight. The Apocrypha vault does not close. Its doors of relic gold and ash-gray stone remain open in the dark between one breath and the next, holding the space where the oldest questions wait with the patience of things that have already outlasted every empire that tried to answer them with silence. Come back when the night is deep enough. There is always more buried beneath the burial. And as you cross the threshold between this world and whatever the sleeping mind finds when it descends below the 7 heavens of ordinary thought, hold this one quiet question with you, soft as the sediment of an ancient river settling onto the floor of a vanished sea. If the ground you walk on is the body of something older than the gods who claimed to have tamed it, what does that make the darkness you are about to enter? Rest now. The clay remembers everything. You do not have to. There is nothing left to uncover tonight. The tablets have been read. The jars have been opened. The ghost word in the 2nd verse of the oldest book in the Western canon has been named, and the name beneath the name has been spoken quietly into the dark where you are lying now. And the dark has received it with the particular stillness of something that was always waiting to be acknowledged. Let everything you have carried through this vault begin to release its weight. Not because the questions have been answered. They have not been answered. They cannot be answered, not fully, not by any tradition that has yet found the right language for what it was pointing at, but because the questions themselves, held with the right quality of attention, become something other than urgent. They become the texture of the dark itself. They become the thing you float in rather than the thing you struggle against. The Enuma Elish has dissolved back into the clay it was carved from. Somewhere in the sediment layers beneath modern Iraq, in the geological memory of the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the ash of Ashurbanipal's library still holds the molecular trace of every word that was pressed into those 7 tablets. The story of Tiamat does not need your wakefulness to continue existing. It was already 3,000 years old when the first Christian bishop decided it was dangerous. It will be 3,000 years older, long after the last institution built to contain its implications has followed Babylon into the patient earth. Feel the specific weight of that continuity pressing gently down on you now. Not as a burden, but as a blanket. The warmth of something vast and indifferent to the urgency of any single human night. Marduk's net has long since dissolved into the dark between the stars it was meant to organize. The four winds that held its corners open have dispersed into the general atmosphere of a world that no longer remembers being a battlefield. The arrow that split the Chaos Dragon down the middle has become, across the distance of 4,000 years, something closer to a myth of the myth. A story about the way human civilizations have always needed their violence to have been cosmologically necessary, to have been the founding act of something worth preserving. The storm god who demanded supremacy as his price for saving the divine assembly has himself been superseded, absorbed, overwritten by successive layers of theological revision, until the empire that exalted him is itself a layer of ash beneath the surface of a country whose name has changed 3 times since Babylon fell. The ziggurats are rubble. The Akitu festival has not been performed for 2 millennia. The annual public recitation of the Enuma Elish, which once filled the streets of the most powerful city on earth with the liturgy of cosmic slaughter, has been replaced by the silence of a desert that does not distinguish between the ruins of the conqueror and the ruins of the conquered. Everything that demanded to be remembered has been forgotten by the civilization that demanded the remembering. Only the clay survived, only the words pressed into fired earth by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years retained the specific shape of what was understood about the nature of the world and the violence at its origin. And you are one of the very few living beings on this earth tonight who has sat with those words long enough to feel their full weight. Not as information, not as academic content to be processed and stored and retrieved on demand, but as the oldest available human answer to the question that never stops being asked. In the dark hours, in the hours exactly like this one, when the biological machinery of wakefulness begins to loosen its grip, and the mind drifts toward the place it visits every night without fully understanding where it goes. What is the dark, and what lives in it, and am I safe within it? The Babylonians believed the dark was the body of the goddess. The exiled Israelite priests believed the dark was the passive, inanimate waiting of an abyss that their god had already organized into obedience. The Gnostic community of Nag Hammadi believed the dark was the outer boundary of the Demiurge's 7 counterfeit heavens, and that beyond it, further than the lion-faced serpent's architecture could reach, there was a light so complete it made the concept of darkness irrelevant. None of them were wrong about the thing they were pointing at. They were each holding a different edge of something too large for any single tradition to fully circumscribe. The abyss that Tiamat embodied, and the Tehom that the priestly scribes neutralized into grammar, and the outer darkness into which Sophia cast her deformed creation, are all the same ancient human confrontation with the incomprehensible scale of what lies outside the small, lit circle of the known. Every civilization that has ever sat in the dark and tried to explain what the dark was has produced a version of the same story. Something vast and conscious inhabits it. Something ordered and violent came and organized it into the world we can survive. And whatever was in the dark before the ordering is still there, contained but not destroyed, chained but not dead, waiting with the patience of something that predates the concept of waiting. You are lying inside the small, lit circle right now. Your room, your bed, the specific temperature of the air around you, the particular quality of the silence that surrounds you at this exact hour. These are the most recent version of what every civilization in human history has been trying to build and maintain against the incomprehensible scale of what lies outside it. The ordered world. The place where the chaos has been pushed back far enough that a biological creature can close its eyes without being immediately dissolved back into the primordial dark. You are safe in the way that the ancient world understood safety. Not because the chaos does not exist, but because the structure holds. Because the ceiling of dead flesh that Marduk stretched over the primordial waters, or the firmament that the god of Genesis established over the face of the deep, or the seven heavens that even the flawed and arrogant Demiurge managed to fabricate from the materials of the abyss, is holding tonight, as it has held every night of your life, and every night of every life that preceded yours, back to the first human being who looked up at the sky and understood, in whatever pre-linguistic way the oldest human minds processed such things, that something was keeping the chaos out. Let the structure hold tonight without your assistance. You do not need to understand it to be protected by it. The clay remembers. The tablets endure. The words pressed into fired earth by hands that dissolved into the same soil 4,000 years ago are still carrying the shape of what was known, and what was feared, and what was ultimately, imperfectly, but sufficiently organized into a world where something as small and brief and luminous as a human being can lie in the dark and ask the oldest questions without being consumed by them. Somewhere below the surface of everything you walk on, Tiamat's body is still the floor of the world. Somewhere in the second verse of the oldest text in your tradition, the ghost of her name is still pressed into the grammar like a fossilized impression in sedimentary stone. Somewhere in the sealed and airless dark of a cosmological region that the Gnostics called the outer boundary of the seventh heaven, a lion-faced god is still maintaining the architecture of a world he built from ignorance and stolen light, genuinely believing himself to be the singular sovereign of all reality. And somewhere, above all of that, further than any of the traditions that have been opened here tonight could fully map, the pleroma radiates its impossible completeness into the silence between things. The fullness that contains the fragment of light you have been carrying through the biological machinery of this life without knowing its origin or its destination, pressing it through every experience of beauty and grief and inexplicable longing that the human condition produces in a creature that was made for something larger than the cage it was placed in. The divine spark that the Gnostics said was buried in every human being does not require your wakefulness to continue burning. It burns in the dark. It burns in the deep sleep that is approaching you now, in the specific quality of heaviness that begins at the edges of consciousness and moves inward toward the center, dissolving the boundary between the small lit circle of the known and the vast, ancient, structurally necessary dark that surrounds it. The Apocrypha vault holds this one gentle question for you to carry down into sleep. If the oldest human traditions all agree that something of the highest light was hidden inside you by the very architecture of this world's making, what have you been dreaming about all these years that you could not quite remember when you woke? The heavy doors remain open, relic gold at their edges, ash-gray stone in their depth. The darkness between them, warm with the accumulated breath of every question that has ever been pressed into clay and sealed in earth, and found again by hands that did not know they were looking. The vault does not require you to return. It simply remains. As Babylon remains beneath its desert, as Tiamat remains beneath the floor of the world, as the light remains beneath everything the darkness was built to make you forget. The sediment of 4,000 years settles softly over you now. The rivers flow on from wherever they have always flowed from. The clay remembers. You may sleep.